dear listeners. Welcome back to our podcast. I'm Linda, and with me is Leo. How are you doing today, Leo?
I'm doing great, Linda. Hello to all our listeners out there. Today, we have a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about something that has fascinated people for over 100 years, the Titanic.
That's right, Leo. The Titanic was one of the largest and most famous ships ever built. It was known as the unsinkable ship, but as we'll find out, things didn't go as planned. This story is both fascinating and tragic.
Yes, it's a story that many people know a little about, but today we're going to dive deeper into what happened. And, of course, we'll explain everything in a way that's easy to understand, so you can practice your English while learning about history.
So, let's start from the beginning. The Titanic was built in Belfast, Northern Ireland. It was a huge ship, about 269 meters long, which is almost the length of 3 football fields. It was built by a company called White Star Line.
That's right, and the Titanic wasn't just big. It was also very luxurious. The ship was like a floating palace. There were beautiful rooms, fancy restaurants, a swimming pool, a gym, and even a library. It was designed to be the most comfortable and luxurious way to travel across the Atlantic Ocean.
But why did they call it unsinkable? Well, the Titanic had 16 compartments in the bottom part of the ship. These compartments were designed so that if water got into one of them, the ship would still be able to float. The builders thought that even if 4 of these compartments were filled with water, the ship would not sink. That's why many people believed it was unsinkable.
It sounds impressive, doesn't it? But as we know, this wasn't enough to save the ship. So, let's talk about its first and only voyage. The Titanic set sail from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912. Its destination was New York City in the United States. There were about 2,224 people on board, including passengers and crew members.
Yes, and the passengers on the Titanic were from different backgrounds. Some were very rich and famous, like businessmen and celebrities. They stayed in first-class cabins, which were very luxurious. But there were also many people who were not so rich. They were in third-class cabins, and they were mostly immigrants hoping to start a new life in America.
The Titanic made stops in France and Ireland before heading out into the open Atlantic Ocean. Everything was going smoothly, and the passengers were enjoying the trip. The weather was clear and the sea was calm. But there was something very dangerous ahead that they didn't see coming: icebergs.
Yes, and icebergs are large pieces of ice that float in the sea. The crew received several warnings from other ships about icebergs in the area, but for some reason, the Titanic continued to sail at full speed. The captain, Edward Smith, was very experienced, but he didn't slow down the ship.
Then, late at night on April 14, 1912, something terrible happened. At around 11:40 p.m., one of the lookouts saw a huge iceberg directly in front of the ship. He quickly rang the bell and called the bridge to warn them. The crew tried to turn the ship to avoid the iceberg, but it was too late. The Titanic hit the iceberg on its right side.
And this is where the tragedy really begins. The iceberg caused a long, deep cut in the side of the Titanic. Water started to pour into the compartments at the bottom of the ship. Remember how we said the Titanic could float even if her compartments were flooded? Well, in this case, 6 compartments were filling up with water, and that was too much. The ship started to sink.
The passengers and crew were in shock. They didn't believe the ship could sink, so at first they didn't panic. But as the water kept rising, it became clear that the Titanic was going down. The crew started to lower the lifeboats, but there weren't enough for everyone. The Titanic only had 20 lifeboats, which was enough for about half of the people on board.
That's right, and many of the lifeboats that were lowered were not even full. People were confused, and some didn't want to leave the unsinkable ship. They thought they would be safer on the Titanic than in a small lifeboat in the freezing cold ocean.
The situation became more desperate as the ship continued to sink. The front of the Titanic went underwater first, and the back of the ship started to rise up out of the water. People were trying to hold on, but it was getting harder and harder to stay on the ship. The temperature of the water was below freezing, so even if someone made it into the water, they wouldn't survive for long.
It's such a heartbreaking story. And what makes it even sadder is that many lives could have been saved if there had been more lifeboats or if the lifeboats had been fully loaded.
Yes, it's a story of missed opportunities and human error. And we'll talk more about the final moments of the Titanic and the people who survived. And the Titanic story is one of the greatest tragedies in history. But it's also a story of bravery and survival.
Absolutely. So we talked about how the Titanic hit an iceberg and started to sink. Now, let's talk about the final moments of the ship and the fate of the people on board.
As the Titanic continued to sink, the crew did everything they could to save as many people as possible. But the situation was chaotic. The lifeboats were being launched, but there were still many people left on the ship. As we mentioned, there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone.
Yes, and as the front of the ship sank deeper into the water, the back of the ship rose higher and higher into the air. People were holding on to anything they could find. Some were trying to climb up to the back of the ship, hoping it would give them more time. It was a terrifying scene.
Eventually, the Titanic broke in two. The front part of the ship disappeared under the water, and then the back part followed. Within just a few minutes, the Titanic was completely gone, and all that was left were the lifeboats and the people struggling in the freezing water.
It's hard to imagine what that must have been like. The water was so cold that most people who fell in didn't survive for more than a few minutes. Only the people in the lifeboats had a chance. But even in the lifeboats, people were scared and didn't know what to do.
That's right, Linda. There were about 700 survivors who made it into the lifeboats. But they had to wait in the cold and dark for hours before help arrived. The ship that rescued them was called the RMS Carpathia. It was about 4 hours away when the Titanic sent out its distress signals.
And by the time the Carpathia arrived, it was too late for many people. The crew of the Carpathia did everything they could to help the survivors, giving them blankets, food, and medical care. But the loss was devastating. Over 1,500 people lost their lives in the disaster.
The sinking of the Titanic shocked the world. People couldn't believe that such a modern and unsinkable ship could have met such a tragic end. There were many questions about what went wrong, and investigations were held to find out who was responsible.
Yes, and these investigations revealed that many mistakes had been made. For example, there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone, and the lifeboats that were there were not used properly. The ship was also going too fast in an area known to have icebergs, and the crew didn't take the iceberg warnings seriously enough.
These mistakes led to changes in the rules for ships. After the Titanic disaster, ships were required to have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. There were also new rules about how fast ships could go in dangerous areas and how they should communicate with other ships.
The story of the Titanic has been told many times in books, movies, and documentaries. It's a story that continues to fascinate people today. But it's also a reminder of how important it is to be prepared and to learn from our mistakes.
Absolutely, and it's also a story of bravery. There were many acts of heroism that night: the crew members who stayed on board to help others, the musicians who kept playing music to calm the passengers, and the people who gave up their seats in the lifeboats to save others. These are stories that should not be forgotten.
That's so true, Leo. The Titanic disaster is a tragedy, but it's also a story of human strength and courage. And it teaches us that even in the darkest times, there is always hope and kindness.
We hope you've learned something new, not just about the history, but also about the importance of safety and caring for others. And, of course, we hope you've enjoyed practicing your English with us.
Yes, we always try to make learning interesting and fun. So if you have any questions or if there's a topic you'd like us to talk about in the future, please let us know in the comments.
Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, take care and keep learning.
Bye for now, everyone.